Welcome to the 4th International Apologetics Marathon here on the Trinity Channel. Once again, my name is Mike Burtovich. I'm professor of biochemistry at Spring Arbor University here in Michigan. And I'm joined in the studio once again by Mr. Ed Rivet. And Ed is the legislative director for Michigan Right to Life. He is based in our capital, Lansing, here in Michigan. Our subject for today is euthanasia. Is it merciful or is it murderous? I'd like you to consider something with me before we get into our discussion. Let's say we have a terminally ill patient who deteriorates before the eyes of the people he loves. He becomes more of a burden on them as each day goes by. This once active paragon of health and vibrancy has to have someone dress him, bathe him, feed him, take him to the bathroom and wipe the drool that starts to spill out of his mouth. Such a life, some people assert, is simply not worth living. He has no, as the saying goes, quality of life. And if we are really compassionate, what we should do is offer him the means to end such a degrading existence by legally allowing a physician to administer a lethal cocktail of various drugs and let that patient go peacefully, without pain and with dignity. This is a scenario that is painted by advocates of this thing called euthanasia. And this is our topic for tonight, and we thank you so much for joining us. So, Ed, tell me, euthanasia, that sounds kind of like something from Greek class. What is euthanasia? What does it mean?
Well, it is based in the Greek word, and it means a good death. And that's that scenario you were painting, this idea that people, as they face terminal illnesses or the degeneration from certain diseases, that their life becomes not worth living, and we want to provide them a good death. But from a legal standpoint, from the moral standpoint, what it really is saying is that whether it's the person themselves asking or whether it's a decision of the medical community, the doctor, or the family, this person's better off dead, let's make them dead. And the two kinds of euthanasia that we're most familiar with in our culture today is direct euthanasia, where they would provide the lethal means. The doctor, him or herself, would provide an injection, lethal drugs, or what we call assisted suicide, where the person says, I want to die this way, but I'll do it. I'll take the lethal drugs. I'll do something to kill myself. So it's generally referred to as physician-assisted suicide in those cases. Now, there are some rare cases, or even in the cases of mercy killing, where a husband has a very sick wife, and he may take her life, shoot her, smother her, something like that with a pillow, and then very often they take their own life. And so you see those what they call murder-suicides. And so people can see a number of scenarios where someone becomes so desperate that they will choose some means to kill themselves or kill another person that they have this compassion for. They have this misguided compassion, mercy, as they say. But again, as what becomes important is how does the society deal with it from a legal perspective? And do we give it sanction of law to say it's legal for someone to help assist another person, or for a physician to provide that legal means, or actually inject the patients with some lethal cocktail, as you say. It's when they cross over to society's acceptance that it becomes a significant reality.
So where throughout the world is euthanasia and assisted suicide practiced, and where is it legal?
Well, it's not as commonly practiced as, say, for example, abortion, as we've discussed previously, nor is it legal in as many places. But it is growing. It is widely legal, more so legal in Europe, particularly in the Netherlands, in Belgium, Switzerland. They just had a debate very recently in England where they refuse to legalize assisted suicide. Here in the United States, it is not legal across the country in the U.S., but it is legal in a small number of states. Oregon, Washington are the two states where it's most commonly practiced. It is being debated in California currently. There's a bill pending in the legislature, past the legislature and pending on the desk of the governor of the state of California. That would be a significant development because it is our largest state population-wise to legalize assisted suicide in the United States. Now, not the direct injection, but that's when we talk about how it's progressed in Europe in particular. We move from those people who say, I will do the lethal act of taking medication, to doctors making the actual decision and doctors making the lethal action to cause the patient's death.
So countries like the Netherlands and Belgium are pretty far down this road in Europe. What's up with these countries? What's happening with regard to euthanasia and assisted suicide in those countries?
Well, this really is the important thing for our viewers to be aware of, is that in the Netherlands, in Belgium, those Western European countries, they started decades ago with the idea that, well, when a person says, I want to control my own death, the circumstances, give me the lethal drugs, I'll do it myself. I'm going to be in control. And when they began through law to allow that to occur without punishment to the doctors who are providing the lethal medication or any other person assisting them, that's when they began what we call the slippery slope slide. And so over time, they stopped, sanctioning the doctors, and then they didn't sanction the family members, and then pretty soon the doctors could provide the actual injection themselves without being prosecuted. And then they began to move from those people in those terminal situations, those desperate cases as you described. And the slippery slope also included people who weren't terminally ill at all, or who didn't have significant pain, or perhaps had a mental circumstance. So it really began to move to further and further to now in the Netherlands, they are euthanizing newborn babies with handicaps. They have no ability to choose. It's not about them being in pain and suffering. They may have a fairly simple, even correctable condition, but because they have a handicap like Down syndrome or something to that effect, the parents or the doctors are making the decision that you're going to die. You have women, elderly women, I'm depressed, I don't want to live anymore. They're being given access to euthanasia and assisted suicide. So we've moved far away from that first scenario of compassion that you described to situations where people who aren't even physically ill at all are either requesting and being given lethal medications, or even they themselves. Now you have people who are suffering from dementia, a lack of mental capacity. They're not even able to ask or choose, and yet the doctors are deciding to kill them with lethal medications or injections.
So it's involuntary euthanasia.
Absolutely involuntary. We move from this idea, it's my choice to decide how I'm going to die, to other people deciding for you that you are going to die.
Now, I noticed that this whole death with dignity thing that is used to argue for euthanasia, it seems to me they're using dignity to mean control.
That's true.
But they don't really have control, because legally they have to jump through all these hoops, and then ultimately they'll be told it's your decision, but it ends up not being their decision. It ends up being some medical board or somebody else. And it's not even really control. And furthermore, does dignity mean control? I'm not sure it does.
Well, you've hit on a couple of really important points, and I appreciate how you brought them out, because yes, they do kind of equate dignity and control, and so you pointed out accurately that it's not the patient who's in control. Even when they say, well, I will take the medications myself, so I'll decide when I die. Well, the reality is, if that physician doesn't think you're sick enough, or your life isn't worth, isn't in a bad enough strait, or you're not in enough pain, and that physician says, nope, I'm not giving you the medication. Who just decided? Not the patient. They didn't have control. Because in our advanced cultures, we have licensing, we have drug controls, we have all these things. the power really always shifts to the doctor who has access to the medication, who has the ability to write the prescription. And so that idea, as you said, that dignity means I'm in control. Well, it doesn't, because you're not ultimately in control. Then the other half of that, as you also pointed out, as we've seen, if you're going to euthanize a newborn baby, there was no choice, there was no control, and the dignity they're saying is, I'll decide when you die. Where is the dignity in that? I mean, we think in the culture that dignity means I'm respected for who I am, I'm of equal value of everyone else. We think about in the civil rights era in our country, blacks couldn't eat in the same restaurants. They had to ride on the back of the bus.
Yeah,
so our dignity doesn't always come from when I'm in control. Our dignity is when others respect us, when others recognize me as equal to them. And an elderly person who needs assistance, as you said, oh, they need to be taken to the bathroom, they need to be given a bath, they need to have these things done for them. Well, excuse me, but when I was a newborn baby, my mother had to change me, feed me, dress me, take care of me, teach me everything. And if I was abandoned by my parents, I would have died. I was so vulnerable. And that we universally would see that as wrong, that you're not respecting the value and the dignity of a newborn baby when you deny them food or deny taking care of them and bathing them and providing the things that they need. So why, at the end of life, suddenly their dignity, if they require the same attention, is gone? And the truth of it is that's age discrimination. It's like, oh, you're older, doing all those things for you lacks dignity. If you're a baby, doing all those things is just the right thing to do. And so we don't even want to admit that if we accept that idea for the elderly, it's really age discrimination.
Tell me something. How much is the march to euthanasia driven by costs, or is it at all driven by costs?
Well, there are two phenomena that we have to look at in that regard. And one is you may have family members or others who kind of have their own interests in mind. And, you know, if mom stays in the nursing home for a long time, she's going to spend down her inheritance. We don't want that to happen. The sooner mom dies, the sooner we don't spend all of her funds. So there's that risk. And we've seen that in cases of people that take their self-interest and their financial interests. But the other side of it is really when we look at the cost containment in the United States, in Europe, where they have socialized medicine, government medicine, if it begins to cost too much, if you begin to cost too much, then they're going to say, it's time to cut off, you know, Mr. Smith's respirator or Mr. Smith's feeding. We're not going to do that surgery for you because we don't think your life is going to be as beneficial as a result of it. And so the cost containment of healthcare, and when it becomes more and more controlled by the government, then it's tax money. Then the government has a greater compulsion to spend less money. And so now economics begins to drive it. Or insurance companies. We talk about it in the United States. We pay for insurance. Our insurance company, we expect to pay for our health care. Well, what if they start wanting to cut costs? What if they feel compelled to respond to the bottom line of the company, its financial best interest? So they begin to say, well, let's just not pay for that. Let's deny that treatment. And many people have certainly experienced the idea that they thought it was a treatment they deserved and needed, and the insurance company says, nope, that's experimental or whatever, we're not paying for that. So money does become a factor in the way decisions are made.
So the system they paid into their whole lives essentially abandons them.
Well, it very well could.
I've never understood why that's somehow more compassionate. Yet the socialized systems are supposed to be more compassionate. I've never understood that.
Well, you hit on a reality that people, when they focus on the narrow question, does assisted suicide benefit me or euthanasia, because when I want it there. And what they miss is all the negative effects that they don't see that are going to affect people that they didn't intend for it to affect or affect themselves. When they get to the day when the insurance company says, we won't pay for that treatment. Oh, but we will pay for your drugs to kill yourself. And that's a real example that's happened in the state of Oregon, where they had a statewide health system. A woman needed a cancer treatment. They thought it wasn't likely to work for her. It was too experimental. And so they sent her a letter saying, we will not pay for that cancer treatment. But, oh, by the way, the Oregon Health Plan does pay for lethal drugs. So if you decide to kill yourself, that will be covered. And so we see those pressures, and it's happened in more than just that one case. We see the pressures where money begins to drive a decision. And so now, instead of your dignity being respected, you're a calculation of how much money do you cost. And that is a threat to all of us, all of our dignity.
In the Greco-Roman culture in which Christianity was born, of course, suicide was common, and it was extolled as a virtue. We think of the younger Cato, the writer of the Satyricon Petronius, the philosopher Seneca. 4 different Roman emperors all committed suicide. Suicide today is not looked upon with quite that degree of virtue. That influence is probably largely due to Christianity. In the past 100 years or so, what has been the history of the euthanasia movement? What kind of got us to this point?
Well, first of all, you're absolutely correct that suicide itself was transformed in its understanding of it from a virtue to a tragedy. And most of the time, those tragedies we recognize today as the mental health professions began to understand that people commit suicide out of desperation. It's contrary to our own instincts to kill ourselves. And so some circumstance tends to drive us. And then we've also learned that various mental conditions, brain chemistry itself, we now know, can bring about depression, or someone may have a schizophrenic disorder where the brain itself is almost their enemy, and that it drives them to this sense of desperation, and they want to escape pain, they want to escape a difficulty. And so then they choose suicide. But there is a contingent of people out there who view suicide as a means to an end, as a distorted sense of giving people control over their lives. And so, but there are also those who use it for social engineering. I mean, you ask, in the past century, you have the most dramatic example being Hitler, who wanted to create a pure race. He had eugenic ideas in mind. And so long before he applied the Holocaust to the Jews, he was using euthanasia and societal cleansing in that culture as a tool of the state to euthanize the mentally impaired, the physically impaired, the elderly, as he called them, the useless eaters. And so euthanasia, and they would couch it all as relieving people of this terrible situation, the pain that they're in, whatever the case might be. But it was, in fact, a very sinister application of the medical profession, and they sanitized it all with propaganda to tell people that it's okay to kill someone. In our modern era, they've used the advances of medicine, as you described the case, or someone put on a feeding tube and a respirator, and they're in the hospital for a long period of time, and it's almost like they're being assaulted by all this technology, and we need to free people from that terrible pain and even the cost. And so they use the arguments of compassion. They use the arguments that medicine has gone too far and we need to free people from it. So people take different agendas to the same point, and there are just some people who are just obsessed with the idea of death.
Let's take a look at some of the arguments that people use to argue for euthanasia. One argument I hear very often is, well, look, we have a double standard. We would not allow an animal to suffer. That would be inhumane, but yet we'll require a human being to suffer. That's irrational, and that's ultimately cruel. How would you respond to that argument?
Well, as I share with my kids all the time, that animals and people are different. And we have, especially in our modern American culture, this whole animal rights movement, this idea of equating people. But if you think about that for just a second, and I know you have some good thoughts and insights on this too, but we do not treat people and animals the same. We eat animals. When certain animals suffer certain injuries, like a horse breaks its leg, it can't be cured, we shoot the horse, we kill the horse. We don't treat people and animals the same in so many settings. So the idea that in this case, well, if we kill an animal, it's okay to kill a person. There are lots of instances where we don't hesitate for an animal's life to be taken, even out of compassion for the animal. But that, you just can't equate people and animals as the same. We get outraged if we hear of a poor person or an elderly person who has to eat dog food because they don't have enough money. That was a big outrage in the era before Social Security and other supports, that people were found, elderly people were so poor they were eating dog food, and we were offended by the idea. So to somehow then equate, well, we put our dog to sleep, that's okay to put grandma to sleep. It's not. It's not okay to eat, grandma to eat dog food. It's not okay to put grandma to sleep.
What about the argument that there's really no difference, at least morally speaking, between deliberately, actively killing somebody and letting somebody die? You hear that argument. Is there a difference between actively killing somebody but actually letting somebody die?
Well, this is probably one of the best arguments that they like to use, that they use most frequently. And as I mentioned, we were talking a little bit before about all the technology. And so we say, well, this person has been on a respirator and they want to take the respirator off. They just want to die naturally. And this person over here isn't able to breathe, or maybe they can breathe, but they don't want to live anymore. They're both paralyzed. One can breathe on their own, one can't. What's the difference? And there's an enormous distinction, and maybe you can talk about this because you brought up some of the history and the ethics of the previous civilizations. But there's just an enormous difference between allowing nature to take its course and accepting death. And even as Christians, we understand that we're not going to live forever. No one does. God has a design and a plan for everyone's life, and we don't control those days necessarily. And so we have to accept our mortality. We accept the fact that we may not be able to defeat this disease, or in our older years, something is going to take our life. That's an acceptance. But to try and equate that to say, I can purposely choose to cause death, is almost ignoring the reality that if I do something by accident to hurt you, it's an accident. I'm not culpable, legally or otherwise. I may feel bad that accident happened, but I didn't intend for it to happen. When our children break something by accident, we say, well, it was an accident, it's okay. But if our children break something on purpose, or if I attack you or harm you on purpose, now I'm culpable morally, I'm culpable legally, I'm violating you. So there's always an important distinction between saying, oh, this person has this condition, this disease, they don't want chemotherapy, they don't want a respirator, they're going to accept death. And morally, that's a completely different scenario than saying, kill me on purpose, or I want to kill myself. That is a huge leap in moral equation. It's a huge leap in people's legal responsibility for those who would assist or help someone do that.
What about the argument that goes something like this? Well, there's all these abuses or potential abuses for euthanasia, but we can put safeguards up. Safeguards really will solve that problem. That's the argument largely you see in Oregon, that Oregon supposedly has all these safeguards in place. You have to go see a psychiatrist, you have to have a second opinion, you have to, at every step along the way, you have to say, yes, this is my decision, so on and so forth. What about the whole safeguard argument?
Well, they put those in place, but then if you study what actually has happened there, the slippery slope we discussed in Belgium and the Netherlands, you may start with this idea it's going to work, but then it doesn't. I mean, when they passed the law in Oregon to legalize assisted suicide, did it tell the voters, because it actually went on the ballot, did the voters say, oh, so after we pass this law, you may not get your cancer drug paid for, but they will pay for your suicide drug? I think if people saw that so-called safeguard was going to be there to make it their choice, they'd see that was wrong. If you look at the data coming out of Oregon, almost none of the people that used the system, they take the lethal drugs, almost none of them were referred for a psychological evaluation. So they could very well been clinically depressed, and there was no checking up on that. There was no determining whether the people that were using the drugs were actually experiencing the pain they were afraid. So, oh, I'm going to have this terrible pain at the end. I want that drug available. And yet, when they then asked the people why they wanted the drug, they weren't afraid of pain. They were afraid of not being able to do things for themselves. They were afraid of that. But so they're not doing psychological evaluations. They're not providing the drug for pain or terrible terminal illness situations. And then the people admit themselves that they're not worried about pain. They're worried about being able to do things. So the safeguards, and yet they're getting the drugs. So the idea that this is just for those desperate cases when someone is going to die in terrible death is not at all how it's actually playing out. And in Belgium and in the Netherlands, it's gone completely over the edge. Healthy people, people that are depressed. I think you saw a case, maybe you could share that case of the woman who, after her husband and her daughter died, she went and sought euthanasia. Where is the safeguard there?
In Switzerland, it's called suicide tourism. And people go there essentially to be put to death. It's just remarkable. That's not something I'd want to be known for in my country.
Yes, yeah, the clinic where you go, it's kind of a bed and breakfast for death. You go there and they facilitate you killing yourself. And then sometimes the families don't even know. And so they get contacted by this organization, Dignitas it's called. And they say, yes, your loved one has come here to Switzerland. They've used our services here. And where do you want us to ship the body? Or the ashes. They requested cremation. We killed them here in Switzerland. We've had them cremated. We need to return the ashes. Where would you like them sent? And this is how sometimes people find out that their loved one has utilized this service. They aren't even notifying the family members that someone that they love is coming to commit suicide at their clinic. They might travel from England or France or someplace into Switzerland and kill themselves, and the so-called safeguard, that person, the family's like, wait, did they get a psychological evaluation? Why weren't we informed in advance? This was our loved one. How could you, a stranger, help kill my aunt or my mother or my grandmother or someone? And I didn't even know that they were going there for that reason. Safeguards? I don't think so.
Yeah. What about the democratic argument? Well, if you don't like euthanasia, then fine, don't do it. But it's improper for you to impose your views on me. And if I want it, then I should have the right to have euthanasia.
Well, I mean, that's the argument they make. They make the same types of arguments for abortion. But we have to recognize what are the implications. And most of those people, as you just said, it's my business. It'll be my choice. Let me do what I want to do. Well, that's that fallacy we discussed. You go and ask the doctor, I have this terrible condition, whatever it might be, and I can see it's coming and I want to be in control. Give me the drugs. And the doctor says, no. No, who just made the decision? It's a fiction for people to think that if we legalize it, that they are in control. They're not going to be in control, because ultimately the doctor is the one who has the ability to prescribe. And if he or she says, no, I don't think you're sick enough, I don't think your pain is bad enough yet, I don't think you don't have control. And on the other hand, when the doctor should be saying those things, when the doctor says, I think you're depressed, if at that point the doctor's just writing the prescription for everyone who asks, then all sorts of people will be vulnerable to killing themselves. And in some cases, what if they had a wrong diagnosis? What if they thought they had cancer and it was not cancer?
Doctors make mistakes.
Doctors make mistakes. Test results can be wrong. There are all kinds of people walking around today who were told, you have 6 months to live. You have a year to live. And they were wrong. Or the treatment they didn't think was going to work actually worked. And so I like to call them, they're all the walking dead people. They're not zombies. There are people whose lives were supposed to come to an end by the doctor's prediction, and the doctor was wrong.
We're coming up to our break, and when we come back, I want to talk about some of the more public cases of euthanasia, at least in the United States. So stay with us. This is the 4th International Apologetics Marathon. We are talking about the subject of euthanasia.
ABN and Trinity Channel would like to invite you to 2 special live debates, Shabir Ali versus David Wood. The first debate will be on Monday, September 28th, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 7 p.m. Greenwich, and 4 a.m. Australian Time. The topic will be,
was Jesus the Son of God or only the prophet of God?
The second debate will be on Tuesday, September 29th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 7 p.m. Greenwich, and 4 a.m. Australian Time. The topic will be, Paul or Muhammad, who gives us the truth about Jesus? Watch us live on ABN and Trinity Channel, or visit our website at trinitychannel.com or abnsat.com. For more information, call the numbers at your screen.
مزگێنی بۆ هەموو بینەرانی کەناڵی ئارامی لە هەموو جێگایەکی ئەم جیهانە. ئەمڕۆ تۆڕی میدیای ئارامی دەستی پێکرد.
ABN and Trinity Channel invites you to watch a special live debate, Imam Ijazi Ahmed versus Dr. Tony Costa. The topic will be,
Was Jesus the Son of God or only the prophet of God?
the debate will be held October 9th, 2015, 7 p.m. Eastern, 12 a.m. Greenwich, and 9 a.m. Australian. Watch us live on ABN and Trinity Channel, or visit our websites trinitychannel.com and abnsat.com. Or for more information, call us at one of the numbers on your screen.
We're back here at the 4th International Apologetics Marathon here at the Trinity Channel. I'm Mike Burtovich, Professor of Biochemistry at Spring Arbor University. I'm joined by Ed Rivet from Michigan Right to Life. He's the Legislative Director at Michigan Right to Life. We're talking about euthanasia. Is it merciful or is it murderous? Ed, before the break, we were talking about some of the reasons people give in favor of euthanasia. We saw that they don't really hold a lot of water. What about a very public case here in the United States, the case of Brittany Maynard, a young American woman who made a very public statement by the way she wanted to commit suicide with medical assistance, even going so far as to move to Oregon. What can you say about that case?
Well, you know, that's an example of a number of people who have turned this into a kind of a crusade, an agenda that they want to put forward. Because Brittany Maynard could have been like any number of people who have moved to Oregon or taken advantage of the law there, quote unquote, or in the state of Washington. But she announced it in advance. And the organization that was helping her, Compassion and Choices, which is a pro-euthanasia organization, it is their goal to legalize euthanasia and assisted suicide across America. And they're using a state-by-state approach. And so they wanted to use Brittany essentially as a poster child. She knew that she had a brain cancer. It was very much a terminal situation. But she made a video. They put it out on YouTube. They wanted it to go viral. So she was becoming a spokesperson for this. She was becoming an advocate for this. And what became apparent as she was documenting this, and the media would come and interview her and her family, she was still very vibrant at the time that she was targeting, and she set the date in advance. All of us kind of wonder, I wonder how many days I have of life. God is the author of life, and how long am I going to be here? How many chapters of my life? And yet she was saying, on November 1st, I'm going to die. I'm going to kill myself. It just strikes at the core of our understanding that we don't control that reality, that it seems counterintuitive. So then, as she got very near, she was doing her bucket list, as we call it here in the United States. She was going places and doing things that she wanted to make sure she did before she died. And it was clear to people that a week to 10 days before her scheduled suicide, she was visiting the Grand Canyon. She was doing very vibrant, active things. And everyone could look at it and go, is this a person who should be planning their own death in another week or two? And so then she even started to hedge a little bit as the day got closer. Maybe I'll have to see how fast the disease progresses and how bad my pain is. You could almost see that she was now regretting that she had boxed herself in. And then in the end, she still committed suicide that day. She took the lethal drugs. But there are a lot of people who wondered, did she still have more she wanted that she could have done? But because she became this spokesperson for a cause, that she had boxed herself in and now took away her own choice to continue to live. And that's an example of how we start to legitimize killing, and then it starts to victimize the very people that they say it's going to liberate somehow.
What about another very high-profile case, the Terri Schiavo case here in the United States?
Well, that was a case from about a decade or so ago, where Terri was brain damaged from a medical condition. She was not on a ventilator. She was conscious at various times. She couldn't speak any longer. She had severe brain damage, and her own mother and father and family members wanted to continue to take care of her. She was fed by a feeding tube, but her husband wanted her to be starved to death. And he made the case that this is not how she wanted to live. It's her wishes. He went to court. They had a big, long court battle. And then ultimately, he won the ability to take away the food and water. So she didn't have a terminal condition. They didn't turn off a ventilator. They basically just starved and dehydrated her to death.
Which is not a pleasant way to die.
Which is not a pleasant way to die. And it was very clear that this was an intentional causing of her death. And that right at the very beginning, you asked that question, what's the difference between allowing someone to die and causing their death? What makes it a euthanasia? Well, if you stop feeding any of us, we'll die. And so they were making a very intentioned effort to cause Terri Schiavo's death. And so those kind of cases, they had people out in front protesting. The family spent tens of thousands of dollars on legal battles because they understood this was killing Terri Schiavo, not allowing her to die.
So who are the groups who support euthanasia, and who are the groups that also oppose it?
Well, there are, and that's a strange thing that people might go, well, what do you mean? There are groups that support this? And actually there are. Even in the United States, there's Compassion and Choices. They were originally called the Hemlock Society after the hemlock drug that Socrates took to kill himself, as you mentioned, ancient Greek culture. And they're committed to legalizing assisted suicide. They changed their name to Compassion and Choices. There's the Dignitas group that you mentioned that have the travel tourism in Europe and in Switzerland. You have individual activists. There was the famous case here in Michigan in the United States. So, I mean, we're broadcasting from Michigan, not far from where Dr. Jack Kevorkian back in the 1990s killed dozens of people. And he had a whole crusade to try and legalize assisted suicide and euthanasia. Derek Humphrey, the founder of Hemlock. There is Dr. Nietzsche in Australia. He's got a whole crusade. He's written books. He's done videos where they have a campaign where they oftentimes will manipulate vulnerable people, bring them kind of into their web, and then help them kill themselves. Or in Dr. Kevorkian's case, he was literally facilitating euthanasias He would gas them with carbon monoxide. He had some where he had injections, machines that he had developed. So you have all these proponents. And on the contrary side, not only do you have religious organizations and churches, but the medical community itself. The American Medical Association has not acknowledged assisted suicide as a legitimate act of doctors, as they go way back to the Hippocratic Oath of a few thousand years ago to say the doctor should always cure, he should never kill. And the distinction between the medicine man who used to come and you didn't know if the medicine man was going to cure you or kill you, the true evolution of medicine came in the Hippocratic Oath to say doctors shall never kill. So they're opposed. Pro-life organizations like ours, disability rights groups, because they see most often who is targeted by assisted suicide euthanasia. People like Terry Schiavo with disabilities, people who have various crippling diseases. And they see that who gets the sympathy, the compassion, who'd want to die. And of course it makes sense if they want to request euthanasia, people with disabilities. And so the disability rights groups say, look, we've fought for our rights as disabled people. We fought to get fair pay. We fought to get access to buildings, handicap access to buildings. And yet, who is it that most often able-bodied people will argue are legitimate cases for euthanasia? It's people with disabilities. So you have disability rights groups that are very, very strongly opposed to euthanasia.
I believe one group is called Not Dead Yet.
Yes, a group in the United States. And they're people with disabilities saying, look, we get it. We know you say, oh, that person on the ventilator, that person in the wheelchair who's been paralyzed, you know, their life's not worth living anymore. And yet the people with disabilities have fought for decades to be recognized as people who can contribute, people who value their lives, people who will say, we are discriminated against. And euthanasia is the worst form of discrimination of all. And they recognize it.
Now, if you give someone the option of euthanasia, you're supposedly giving them more choices. But according to disability groups, you're actually putting a burden on them. Why is that? Why would they say that?
Well, what they're pointing to is there is a mentality in society that says, it's time for you to get out of the way. You might be costing us too many, Medicaid dollars here in the United States, or Medicare dollars. You're costing us too much. So they say, well, we're giving you this choice, but in the end, like we talked about the case in Oregon, well, we'll pay for your suicide drug, but we're not going to pay for your cancer treatment. Now, what choice have you really given them? If you don't give them all their choices, if you don't give them the choice of a cancer treatment, if you don't give them good care, say, for example, hospice care, but what you give them is the cheapest available choice, which is a couple of lethal drugs for you to swallow or something, which hardly costs any money at all, you've actually made them worse off. So when you legalize it, you've taken away their good choices and left them with just bad choices. Well, here's your choice, kill yourself. Is that making things better for them? Is that giving everyone an equal dignity in their life? It's not. It's actually making them worse off. You know, you have people who talk about game theory or choice theory, and they'll basically say, unless you give them every good option, giving them a bad option of suicide makes them worse off.
So the right to die actually evolves into the duty to die.
In many cases, and as we've talked about, especially in Europe, and then if you don't exercise that duty, if you aren't getting the hint from your family that it's time for you to get out of the way or you're costing too much, they'll just make the decision for you. The person who has Alzheimer's or dementia and they can't choose anymore, the society, the family, the doctor makes a decision for them. And so it literally becomes homicide.
Legalized homicide.
Legalized homicide, absolutely.
Oh, mercy. So some people, though, if they don't have the choice of euthanasia, might end up dying a really horrible death from some ravaging disease. Don't these people deserve to be free of suffering? Shouldn't we give them the chance to not have to suffer like that?
And absolutely, and that's our biggest obligation And we're fortunate in today's times that we have advanced pain management. And if someone is in pain, they need to find another doctor. The pain specialists are there. They can control pain circumstances without necessarily putting you into a stupor, or you're just not aware of things anymore. And in very, very rare cases, at the very end, the last hours of life, if someone has a very painful cancer or something, they may have to sedate that patient. But that means they're going to die peacefully, unaware of their pain, and usually within just the last few hours or a day of life. It's not a long, protracted thing where they keep you sedated for days and weeks on end. But the other beautiful thing is hospice care. And hospice care was developed by a Christian nurse in England, Dame Cicely Saunders. And she understood the dignity and the beauty of each person, but also that death is a part of life, that the goodbyes that we need to say, that the forgiveness we might need to give or seek from others, kind of those closing chapters in our life. If we take that from people, we steal things. There are many times that in facing a terminal situation, that's when a person finds their faith. That's when broken relationships are healed. And with hospice care, it isn't just about managing their pain. That's what she understood. Hospice care is a multidisciplinary approach. You don't have a doctor who manages your pain or your symptoms. You have a doctor, you have nurses, you have therapists of various kind, you have social support, you have religious support, you have, and they don't support just the patient, they support the family, because we as family members are experiencing the loss of a loved one too. We're watching their condition degrade, or we're watching the disease process continue. And so hospice is there to support us as we support the person going through that transition from this life to the next life. We as Christians understand the glory of the next life. And so we look at that last phase of life as an opportunity to make the transition, to put those elements in life, put your house in order, as they might say. And assisted suicide, in the case of Brittany Maynard, I don't think she was done doing all the good she could do for herself and for others. Her family was deprived of those days of transition, and those opportunities to share special moments were cut off. And that's a theft. It's a theft to all the people involved.
Now, often officials from the state of Oregon will say, well, our euthanasia and they don't necessarily call it euthanasia, but that's what it is. Let's call it what it is. That euthanasia and hospice work hand in glove. They work side by side. And Oregon officials will often brag, well, we're first in hospice and we have physician-assisted suicide as well. Are those two actually compatible?
That's an interesting thing, because, you can make numbers say things that you want.
Oh, yes, you can.
And so they might point to this feature or that feature and say, see, that shows we're doing a good job. But when you look at the actual cases, you see that they, like we talked about, they're not giving referrals for mental health screening or depression. They are denying people coverages for certain treatments. One of the things that's becoming a trend in their data is they have a higher rate of suicide outside of the assisted suicide realm. People who are committing suicide on their own from depression or whatever the case might be, and they're taking more desperate measures. They may be, shooting themselves, hanging themselves, whatever, these terrible forms of suicide. And their rates have increased in states that have legalized assisted suicide, at least in Oregon, where it's the longest. You're seeing these ripple effects of, well, assisted suicide is legal here. It's okay to kill yourself because doctors will help kill you. So, if I just want to take care of it myself. And these people are not getting any access to health care, to mental health treatment, those crisis intervention situations where we work so diligently to try and help people not kill themselves. And because they're in a state where it's legal, you're just seeing the barriers kind of fade away, and they make them more vulnerable to suicide.
Wow. There's an article in the Hastings Center report that says that most organ hospices do not participate actively in organ-assisted suicide. So the organ hospices simply are not cooperating with assisted suicide. It's as though those two are like oil and water. They refuse to mix. And I think you were saying earlier, some of the most heavily voiced opponents of euthanasia are hospice physicians, yes?
Absolutely, yeah. Some of the strongest opponents are the doctors and the nurses and those involved in hospice care, because they see the stealing, as I mentioned, the theft of an important part of life. They're dedicated to people having a good death. And euthanasia, as we talked about, means a good death. And they're the ones that want people to experience that, and they know what they can do to help people. So they're some of the strongest opponents, because they see, and they also see the effects. You know, if we talked about Dr. Kevorkian here in Michigan, we've talked about the cases in other countries. If you study or then follow up with, and it'll be interesting to see 5-10 years from now how Brittany Maynard's family has coped with her death. But we see that the people left behind can be very traumatized by the experience of assisted suicide or euthanasia, whether they were part of it or whether they weren't part of it. And especially those family members who were excluded from the decision, who were not part of the process, when someone else intervened, the long-term effects of that person's loss, that they say, what could I have done differently? How is it that I wasn't there to give them a different choice? And so there are long-term consequences for the people who are left behind. And so it can compound the tragedy. It's already, we've lost that person. We have to grieve that person. But then you put on top of it this layer of, they chose to kill themselves. Was there something I should have done differently? And then there are just the cases that are botched. They take the drugs and they don't die for days. And now the family is put through this trauma of, well, what are we going to do now? Are they going to linger like this? Sometimes they wake up. Sometimes the drug doesn't work at all, and the person wakes up, and then they have to make the decision to try again. And this can create tremendous trauma on the family, because now they thought this lovely, rosy death is going to happen, and it doesn't happen that way at all.
That's actually an argument that euthanasia proponents will make. We need euthanasia because people will try to commit suicide and they will botch it. So we need to bring doctors in so they can do it right. And yet you're telling me that these doctor-orchestrated deaths are actually botched.
They can be. And even when they give lethal injections, sometimes they don't work as they're supposed to. You know, there's all kinds of debate in our country about the death penalty and these injections that are supposed to kill the prisoner, and they don't seem to work right. Well, guess what? If it can happen there, and they're giving very lethal drugs to prisoners that are, supposed to be executed, clearly the same thing can happen with assisted suicide or euthanasia, and it does. And so the so-called good death doesn't always happen the way it's supposed to. And then, as we talked about with these passive euthanasia cases like Terry Schiavo, you starve someone to death over 10, 12, 14 days until they dehydrate, and their body literally can go into convulsions. So they have to give them more drugs to cover up all these symptoms. So death isn't always a pretty or an easy thing. And so when they sell that bill of goods, they often, other people's experiences are very traumatic and not at all what they were promised.
Wow. What does euthanasia do to the medical profession?
Well, this is, as you mentioned, those who are opposed. That's why most medical associations still oppose euthanasia, because we go back to that idea of, if I go to my doctor, do I trust him? Do I know he's going to have my best interests in mind? Is my doctor going to cure me or kill me? Is the doctor being pressured by the healthcare system? by the financial pressures not to offer me treatments because I'm going to cost too much? Is my insurance company telling the doctor not to use these treatments, don't pay for this, or we're not going to pay for that drug, just prescribe that drug, even if the doctor thought that drug would work better? We already see these kind of cost containment issues that make us wonder if we're getting the best treatment. If you put the doctor in the middle and now he has the ability, he or she, to choose, well, I can prescribe this, or I can just tell them that I don't even have to tell them about that treatment. Now, are they, starting to play God with our decisions? And then when the situation gets desperate enough, I'll say, okay, doc, please kill me, because I didn't know that you were withholding options. So the doctor's power and authority becomes even more potentially deadly, and it doesn't serve your interests, and it puts the doctor in sometimes untenable positions.
And we've taken a person who was trained to be a healer, and we asked him to now be a taker of life. Those two seem to me to be completely antithetical to each other.
They are, and they create conflicts, and I know you've got some books there that you've referenced that they have written extensively about the conflicts that it creates for doctors. And so then we say, well, doc, look, I'm in charge, just give me the medicine. And now the doctor has to say, wait a minute, when I went to medical school, I learned about physiology, I learned about medications, I learned about surgeries. Where was the class that said, I'm now the wisest person in the world and I know when to give you a lethal drug and kill you? You can think of the biblical example of Solomon, and he had this tremendous wisdom. But our doctors didn't go to medical school to become Solomon. And they weren't trained to know, now I have the knowledge and the authority to know when to help kill you. That's a decision that doesn't come out of a textbook. And so, yes, it compromises them and puts them in a terrible situation as well.
And then in the Netherlands, where they're actually performing involuntary euthanasia, they're literally the ones who have the power of life and death over someone.
Yes, and what we discover in countries like that is it becomes a small handful of death specialists. Most doctors say, I'm not doing this, or it comes to the lethal injection, I won't do that. And so then the patients start to gravitate toward those doctors who are already predisposed to want to kill people anyway. They almost have it as their mission. So if we don't keep patients away from those death-oriented doctors, we're really setting them up to make those the specialists in killing in the medical community. And as you said, they weren't trained for that. They're supposed to be healers. And so we undermine the validity of the medical practice
and
as a
then
whole.
in Quebec, I understand, there's actually a movement, a legislative movement, to actually force doctors to take part in euthanasia, whether they want to or not.
Yeah, they would at least have to refer them to a doctor. So I might know this is wrong for you as a patient, and yet I'm told by law I have to send you to a deadly patient. To a deadly physician. So,
remarkable. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are out of time. This has been a very enlightening discussion. I'd like to thank Ed Rivet from Michigan Right to Life for being here with us. And I'd like to thank you for joining us on this 4th International Apologetics Marathon here on the Trinity Channel. We hope that you have enjoyed this, and if you did, we hope you will consider supporting this very fine channel. I'd like to leave you with the words of Job 121, who said, "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised."